Pam Bondi had always been familiar with scrutiny. It followed her like a shadow, lingering in the corners of every public space she entered. She knew how it felt to have eyes on her, to hear whispers just out of reach, to anticipate the moment. A stranger's expression shifted from passive recognition to something sharper: judgment, anger, disapproval. It came with the territory. She had learned to navigate it, to carry herself with the practiced composure of someone who refused to be rattled. But tonight, standing under the warm glow of the theater marquee, the air thick with the scent of buttered popcorn and exhaust fumes from passing cars, she felt something different in the energy pressing in around her. She had come here expecting an evening of quiet nostalgia, a documentary about Mr. Rogers, a rare moment of reflection, away from the noise of political battles and media spin. Instead, she had walked straight into a storm. The first voice had been loud, but not deafening. The second had been stronger. By the third, she knew she was in it. "Pam Bondi, do you even understand what kindness means?" The words hit the air like a challenge. Someone was already filming, their phone tilted at just the right angle to capture her reaction. A ripple of murmurs spread through the small crowd of protesters, a mixture of hostility and expectation. They were waiting to see how she would respond. Waiting for her to ignore them, to brush past, to retreat into the safety of the theater's dimly lit lobby. She didn't move right away. Instead, she let her gaze sweep over the group, taking in the faces before her. Some were young, college-aged, their expressions taut with the conviction of those who believed they were standing on the right side of history. Others were older, the weight of their frustration etched into the lines of their brows. A woman in a navy peacoat stood near the front, gripping the strap of her leather purse like it was a lifeline. Next to her, a man in a Red Sox cap held up a sign hastily scribbled in black marker: "Mr. Rogers wouldn't support you." Pam exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to roll her shoulders, to shake off the tension that had settled there. A younger man, late 20s maybe, stepped forward, his jaw tight, his voice razor-sharp. "You worked for Trump, right? You defended him. Now you think you can come here and celebrate Mr. Rogers?" He spat the name like it was an insult. Pam met his gaze evenly. "I did work for him, and I'm here because I want to see a movie. Just like you," the group murmured. "It wasn't enough." "Then tell us," the woman in the peacoat cut in. "Tell us why you support policies that hurt families. Tell us how that fits into kindness." A few scattered cheers erupted from the crowd. Someone clapped, once, twice, like they were waiting for an answer that would never satisfy them. Pam felt the weight of the moment shift. This wasn't just about her. It wasn't even just about politics. It was about the larger battle playing out across the country, the war over who got to claim morality, who got to define kindness, who got to say they stood for what was right. She could leave. She could say nothing, push past, let the moment dissipate into another viral clip that would spark outrage for 24 hours before the world moved on. Or she could take control. She squared her shoulders, stepping toward them instead of away. The shift in her posture was small, but the effect was immediate. The crowd braced itself as if preparing for a fight. "Mr. Rogers believed in listening," she said, her voice even, steady. "He believed in hearing people, even when they disagreed with him." The younger man scoffed, shaking his head. "Oh, come on." "He also believed in speaking to people," Pam continued, cutting through the interruption with quiet force. "Not shouting over them." That made some of them pause. Not all, but some. She glanced at the woman in the peacoat, then at the man with the sign. "You're angry. I get that. You think I don't care about kindness, but kindness isn't about who yells the loudest. It's not about who gets the most retweets or who can make the most people angry in a single moment." A few murmurs. Not all of them positive. She pressed forward. "You can disagree with me. You can protest. That's your right. But don't tell me I don't belong at a movie about Mr. Rogers. Because kindness isn't just for the people you agree with. The moment stretched. The young man shifted on his feet, crossing his arms. He wanted to keep arguing. But for the first time, Pam saw something flicker in his eyes. Uncertainty. The woman in the peacoat hesitated, looking at the others in the group. She wasn't backing down, but the fire in her expression had dimmed just a little. And the man with the sign? He lowered it an inch, just enough to let her know she had struck a nerve. Pam held their gazes a moment longer before stepping back, before finally turning toward the entrance of the theater. The tension still hung in the air, but it wasn't the same. A few protesters continued to mutter. Others exchanged glances as if unsure what had just happened. But no one stopped her as she walked inside. As she reached the theater doors, she heard one last voice behind her. Not loud, not angry, just thoughtful. She's got a point. Pam didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She had already won the moment. Inside the theater, the air was cooler, carrying the buttery scent of fresh popcorn and the faint murmur of quiet conversations. The shift from the street's intensity to the hushed anticipation of the screening was almost jarring. Pam Bondi took a steadying breath as she walked past the concession stand, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The confrontation, outside, still pulsed in the back of her mind, a lingering hum of adrenaline beneath her composed exterior. She could still hear them, their voices, their anger, their certainty that she had no place here. She had spent her career in high-pressure situations, debating policy, facing down critics on live television, standing firm in the face of opposition, and yet something about this moment had unsettled her. Maybe it was the setting. Maybe it was the irony of it all. Protesters standing outside a film about a man who had built his legacy on the belief that people, no matter their differences, could talk to one another with respect. She had stood her ground. She had spoken calmly. She had even seen a flicker of doubt in a few of their eyes. But had it made a difference? Or was she just another villain in their story? Another name to add to the growing list of those they believed had no business speaking about kindness? She exhaled slowly and handed her ticket to the usher. He was a lanky teenager, probably no older than 17, with shaggy brown hair falling into his eyes. He glanced at her, then past her, as if expecting the protesters to come storming in after her. "They're not coming in," she said, offering the hint of a smile. The boy blinked, then gave an awkward nod, tearing the stub. Yeah. Enjoy the movie, ma'am." Pam walked past him, stepping into the dimly lit auditorium. Rows of plush red seats stretched before her, filled with people who had no idea what had just happened outside. A few glanced at her as she made her way down the aisle, but most were engaged in quiet conversations, oblivious to the tension she had just walked through. She slid into her seat, smoothing her skirt as she settled in. The large screen in front of her flickered with pre-show advertisements, trailers for upcoming films, reminders to silence cell phones. She reached for her purse, pulling out her phone to check the time, and that's when she saw it. The confrontation was already online. A notification from a news app lit up her screen. Pam Bondi confronted by protesters at Mr. Rogers' documentary. Video goes viral. She hesitated for only a second before clicking it. A short clip, no more than 30 seconds, played silently on her screen. The shaky phone footage captured the exact moment she turned to face the protesters, the young man's voice demanding to know why she was there, her measured response about Mr. Rogers believing in listening. The headline framed it as a dramatic clash, a battle of ideals outside a film about peace and understanding. Pam scrolled down. The comments section was already on fire. "She has no right to be there. This is what accountability looks like. Mr. Rogers would be ashamed." But then, beneath the noise buried among the outrage, she spotted something else. "I don't like her, but she handled that well. She actually has a point. You can't say kindness is only for people you agree with." Not a fan of Bondi, but maybe this wasn't the right place for a protest? Pam stared at the screen, the glow of the phone reflecting in her eyes. She had expected the outrage. She had expected the accusations. But she hadn't expected this. Small, quiet admissions that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this moment than people wanted to admit. The theater darkened, signaling the start of the film. She hesitated for a moment before locking her phone and slipping it back into her purse. As the opening credits rolled, a familiar voice filled the auditorium, warm and gentle. "Won't you be my neighbor?" Pam exhaled, sinking into her seat. And for the first time that night, she allowed herself to simply watch. The soft melody of the Mr. Rogers Neighborhood theme played over the opening credits, its gentle nostalgia wrapping around the audience like a warm embrace. The darkness of the theater offered a temporary sanctuary, shielding Pam Bondi from the outside world, from the protests, from the headlines already circulating, but her mind didn't quiet. Not yet. She watched as old footage of Fred Rogers filled the screen, his soft-spoken kindness radiating even through the grainy clips. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. He didn't demand attention, yet he commanded it through sheer authenticity. Children had trusted him, adults had admired him, and even now, years after his passing, his message remained. Simple but profound. Pam could feel the tension from earlier still lingering in her body, coiling around her shoulders, making her fingers tighten in her lap. The words from outside echoed in her head. "How dare you come here? Do you even understand kindness?" She closed her eyes for a brief second, forcing herself to let out a slow breath. What had she expected? To sit through a documentary about a man who had preached compassion and not have people throw her political career back in her face. She knew the weight of the decisions she had made. She had stood by them, defended them. She didn't regret her choices. But something about the accusations tonight had struck deeper than the usual protests she faced. It wasn't the anger that got to her. It was the implication that she had no business watching a film about kindness, that she was, at her core, undeserving of it. On screen, the documentary played a clip of Mr. Rogers testifying before Congress in the late 1960s, his voice unwavering yet gentle as he defended public broadcasting, as he spoke about the importance of helping children feel safe in a confusing world. He didn't yell, he didn't attack. He simply spoke, and in doing so, he changed minds. Pam shifted slightly in her seat. She had spent years in politics, years building her image, years learning how to win arguments, how to stand her ground in the face of opposition. But what had just happened outside the theater wasn't about winning an argument. It was about something deeper. Could she have handled it differently? Could she have listened more? She hated the thought that maybe, just maybe, the protesters had expected her to react like every other politician they had confronted. Maybe they had expected her to dismiss them, to scoff, to wave them off as uninformed activists looking for a viral moment. And instead, she had talked to them, and some of them had listened. Her fingers hovered over her purse, debating whether to check her phone again to see how the story was evolving, to find out if she was being vilified or, on the rarest of chances, if people were reconsidering the way they viewed her. She resisted the urge. The film continued, shifting to interviews with those who had known Mr. Rogers personally. One of his former crew members was speaking now, an older man with kind eyes, recalling a moment when Fred Rogers had comforted a child who had just lost his dog. He didn't tell the kid it would be okay. He didn't try to fix it. He just sat with him in his sadness. Pam swallowed hard. How often did she let herself sit with people in their anger, in their grief? How often had she let herself feel it with them instead of trying to justify why things had to be the way they were? She wasn't naive. She knew politics was a battlefield, that decisions had consequences, that you couldn't please everyone. But what if, just for a moment, it wasn't about winning or losing? What if it was about simply being there? She exhaled quietly and focused on the screen again. Outside, the protesters had likely dispersed, their mission accomplished, their videos posted. Tomorrow, the news cycle would move on, and another controversy would take its place. But for now, in this dark theater, under the glow of a film about a man who had built a career on listening and understanding, Pam Bondi let herself do something she hadn't done in a long time. She let herself think. The film moved through the years, tracing Fred Rogers with a careful, deliberate pace. His voice, always gentle, filled the theater, weaving stories of kindness, of patience, of speaking softly but with conviction. Pam Bondi sat motionless, watching as the documentary explored the impact he had on children, on families, on an entire nation that had once relied on him to make sense of the world. She could feel it happening, the subtle but undeniable shift inside her. It wasn't guilt, exactly. She didn't regret her career or the choices she had made. But there was something unsettling about sitting here, in this darkened theater, listening to the story of a man who had fought for compassion at every turn, and knowing that just outside this very building, people had told her she didn't belong, that she wasn't worthy of kindness. The thought lodged itself deep in her chest, and she hated how much it lingered. She stole a glance at the rest of the audience. Most people were absorbed in the film, their faces reflecting the soft glow of the screen. A few wiped their eyes, others nodded slightly at some memory the documentary had stirred in them. For many, Mr. Rogers had been a part of their childhood, a constant figure reminding them they were special just the way they were. Pam had never watched his show much as a child. She had been busy, always running, always pushing forward, even at a young age, but she understood the power of his message. And now, as the film played clips of him breaking barriers, inviting a black police officer to share a footbath with him on air, speaking to Congress with quiet determination, addressing children about grief after national tragedies, she felt something tighten in her stomach. What would he have said to her tonight? Would he have scolded her? Told her she had failed to live up to his ideals? No, that wasn't his way. He would have listened. He would have asked her questions. He would have tried to understand. Pam shifted in her seat, suddenly restless. She wasn't sure when she had started to feel so defensive, so unwilling to believe that anyone who opposed her could have a valid point. Somewhere along the way, politics had become war, and every interaction was a battle to be won or lost. And maybe she had been good at that. Maybe she had been too good at it. But Mr. Rogers had never fought battles. He had bridged them. The screen flickered, transitioning to a segment about his later years. The camera zoomed in on his familiar red sweater, his careful hands tying his sneakers, his eyes full of the same sincerity he had always carried. His voice, calm and steady, spoke words that struck Pam harder than she expected. I think the best thing we can do is to let people know that each one of them is precious. A lump formed in her throat. She had spent her career making tough decisions, standing firm in the face of criticism, brushing off attacks as nothing more than noise. But this was different. The protesters outside had seen her as the enemy. Maybe they always would. But what if, just for a moment, she had the chance to prove them wrong? Not with a debate, not with political strategy, but with something unexpected? Her fingers itched to check her phone again, to see how the story was spreading, but she resisted. She needed to finish this movie. She needed to hear every last word, because, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't just watching, she was learning. The film continued, unraveling the final years of Fred Rogers' life with the same quiet dignity that had defined him in the public eye. Pam Bondi sat motionless. In the dim glow of the screen, the voices of his friends and colleagues narrating his last messages to the world. He had never changed, never wavered, even as the world around him became louder, more cynical, more ruthless. Pam could feel something shifting inside her, not a radical transformation, Not some sudden epiphany that erased everything she had stood for, but something smaller, a realization. A quiet question forming in the back of her mind. When was the last time I listened? Not to defend myself, not to argue, but just to understand. Outside the theater, the protesters were long gone. Their chants faded into the night. But their words remained with her, hanging in the air like ghosts. Do you even understand kindness? She had thought she did. She still believed she did. But Mr. Rogers had defined kindness in a way that wasn't just about being polite or charitable. It was about seeing people, really seeing them, even the ones who hated you. Especially the ones who hated you. Pam exhaled slowly, sinking deeper into her seat as the documentary neared its conclusion. On screen, an old interview played, Fred Rogers speaking in his usual measured way. He had been asked what he thought was the greatest obstacle to kindness in the modern world. Fear, he had answered simply. Pam felt a chill run through her. People are so afraid. Afraid they don't belong. Afraid they're not good enough. Afraid they'll be hurt. And when people are afraid, sometimes they forget how to be kind. She swallowed, suddenly aware of the tightness in her chest. Fear. The protesters outside. Was that what had driven them? Fear that she represented something dangerous? Fear that people like her, people who had served in an administration they despised, would undo the things they believed in? And her? Was she afraid too? Afraid that if she admitted there was some truth to their frustration, she would be seen as weak? Afraid that if she listened too much, if she let them into her head, she might start questioning things she had spent years defending? The thought unsettled her. She had spent her career standing firm, never letting the opposition dictate how she felt. And yet here she was, sitting in a dark theater, feeling something shift inside her just because an old man in a cardigan had dared to say that kindness wasn't about who deserved it. It was about who needed it. A soft sniffle from the row behind her broke her thoughts. Someone else was crying. She wasn't the only one feeling this. She blinked hard, grounding herself in the present moment. The documentary was drawing to a close now, playing one of Mr. Rogers' most famous moments. The time he had asked people to sit in silence and think about someone who had helped them become who they were. The theater fell completely still. Pam sat there, staring at the screen, unsure what to do. Who had shaped her? Who had made her who she was? She thought of her parents, of her mentors, of the people who had believed in her when no one else did. And then, unexpectedly, she thought of the protesters outside. Not because they had shaped her life, but because, in their own way, they had challenged her in a way she hadn't been challenged in a long time. They had forced her to think about something she had ignored for too long. Maybe, just maybe, they were part of this moment too. The film faded to black. Pam let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. And as the credits rolled, she knew. She couldn't leave this night the way she had planned. She had to do something. The soft hum of the credits filled the theater, the names of producers and editors scrolling across the screen. Some people remained in their seats, absorbing the weight of what they had just watched. Others rose quietly, dabbing their eyes, gathering their belongings, murmuring softly to one another. Pam Bondi stayed seated. She wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. Her fingers twitched toward her purse, instinctively reaching for her phone. The urge to check the news, to see how the protest outside had evolved, was almost overwhelming, but she forced herself to resist. She had spent years reacting, responding to headlines, to critics, to opponents who saw her as nothing more than a name, a face, a political figure to be torn apart. Tonight, for once, she wanted to act with purpose. The protesters were gone. Their voices no longer ringing in her ears, but their words still lingered in her mind. The confrontation outside had felt like any other moment of public scrutiny, at first. But something about it was different. Maybe it was because of the setting, because they had accused her of having no right to be in a place dedicated to a man who preached kindness and understanding. Maybe it was because she had seen something in their eyes, something she had spent years ignoring in moments like these. Fear, frustration, desperation to be heard. She had faced it before, over and over, but this time she had actually listened. And in doing so, something inside her had shifted, even if only slightly. Pam finally stood, smoothing the front of her blazer, and made her way up the aisle. As she exited the theater, the cool night air hit her immediately, carrying the distant sounds of the city, cars honking, faint music from a nearby bar, the murmur of late-night conversations. The protest was over. The sidewalk was mostly empty now, except for a few lingering passers-by. But as she stepped toward the curb, she noticed someone leaning against the metal railing near the theater entrance. The young man from earlier, the one who had confronted her first. He was scrolling through his phone, his posture tense, his expression still lined with frustration. He hadn't seen her yet. Pam hesitated. She could walk away. She could let the night end here. She had already made it through the confrontation without an incident, had already watched the documentary that had somehow managed to shake something loose inside her. But Mr. Rogers had taught people to engage, to listen. So she walked toward him. The movement caught his attention, and when he looked up, his expression immediately hardened. He straightened, eyes narrowing. He was expecting her to brush past him, or worse, to confront him again. She didn't. Instead, she stopped a few feet away and folded her arms, regarding him with quiet curiosity. "You're still here," she said finally. He scoffed. "Yeah." And Pam tilted her head slightly. "Did you watch the documentary?" His jaw clenched. "No. I was out here making sure people knew who you really are." There it was. The same defiance, the same righteous anger she had seen in so many others before him. She nodded slowly. "You know, I think you missed something." His brows furrowed. "Oh, yeah? What's that?" She gave him a small, knowing smile. "Mr. Rogers never would have turned me away." The young man opened his mouth, then stopped. His expression flickered. "Just for a second, I didn't say—" He shook his head. "You don't get to use him to defend yourself." "I'm not," she said simply. "I'm just saying that kindness, the kind he believed in, wasn't about picking and choosing who deserved it. It was about everybody, even the people you don't like." He looked away, exhaling sharply. Pam studied him. "What's your name?" He hesitated. "Why do you care?" "Because I don't think Mr. Rogers would want us to end this conversation as enemies." The words landed differently than she expected. The young man's posture shifted just slightly. The hardness in his expression softened, even if only a fraction. Finally, after a long moment, he muttered, "Aaron." Pam nodded. "Aaron," she repeated. "You probably still don't like me. You probably never will. But you stood out here tonight because you care about something, and I respect that." He frowned, as if unsure whether to believe her. She let the silence linger before adding, "You might not think I belong in there, but I think Mr. Rogers would have invited both of us in." Aaron swallowed, his gaze dropping for just a moment. He looked back up, studying her like he was trying to figure out if she was playing a game or if she meant it. Finally, he gave a small, reluctant nod. Pam took a breath. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't a resolution. But it was something. She turned, stepping toward the curb where her car was waiting. As the driver opened the door for her, she glanced back once. Aaron was still there, but this time he wasn't glaring. She smiled, just slightly, before slipping into the car. As they pulled away, she didn't check her phone. She didn't look up the latest headlines or the comment sections tearing her apart. Instead, she leaned back against the seat, closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, let herself feel everything.